First, I must say I was appointed to this against my will. We discussed some of the success stories. We went through the Dutch experience again, and we talked about the Panama Canal experience and the Catskill, but we did agree that these are typical success stories and that we need much more than that. So for the next steps, one of the issues is to really have a more robust inventory of success stories that can help policymakers. In terms of strategies, we talked about obviously the habitat restoration. Obviously, the preference would be conservation, but if it's impacted, restoration and the creation of additional areas. We focus a lot in the water sector pretty much in terms of strategies. We talked about the also adapting the structures to deal with the flooding as a part of the strategy as well. We also discussed the fact that we keep ignoring local and traditional knowledge, and that we need to reincorporate that traditional and local knowledge back into our planning processes. In terms of the barriers, obviously the cost and financing, it's a typical problem. The impact over local communities in terms of when there's a need to relocate communities, the time that it's taking, but also the lack of planning, especially the lack of planning for either the 100 and 500 year benchmarks. But the biggest of all barriers we discuss are the politicians. In terms of the next steps, dissemination, we did find out that there is a very lack of knowledge in terms of policy making and how to go about these investments. So we need to document much better the options that they have. And obviously we discuss who should be the audience of this dissemination. We focus on bankers and policymakers.
All right, thank you very much. We're running a little late, so we're not going to have a lot of time for plenary discussion. So what I'm going to do is very briefly ask each of the panelists to give any further final reflections on the report section, working group, the discussion that you've been in. Please be very brief, because I just want to save 5 minutes for Jack to kind of give us a summary. Maybe we'll start from this end first. So, Omar, want to go first?
Yeah, I want to be very brief. It's interesting to see that there's a lack of kind of information, and while there's a lot of information spread around the world, it seems it doesn't come together, and I think this is quite a challenge. And maybe this is something IUCN could pick up, organizing how you can really get this information now in a form that it is usable, digestible, and that it's available, because I think that keeps coming up. The other element which came out was like what I found interesting is this trust building. I think you see that there's trust in concrete, and that's also spelled that trust with the public, trust with everybody, because that's the way that we've been doing it. But you see it coming up, how you can include a kind of trust building in combinations of structures, in combinations of natural and greens, natural and grey. And I think this is a challenge that should be picked up by someone somewhere, and I think that therefore the information is essential.
I think this session has yielded a lot of really interesting and useful information for us as a donor. And in particular, as we move forward, I think it's going to, we really need to spend some time thinking about the questions that Valerie raised and get those more clear in our minds, and then within CPF as a fund, to have more clarity as we move forward with our own grant making, so that we can come to some sort of more standardized approach or more standardized ability to look at the results of our projects, and that is going to help us then figure out how to replicate that. But I think lots of really great points, and really appreciate your inputs.
Thanks. Lastly, Nick.
I think you guys have said it already, yes. Totally agree with that. I think the issue of communication is speaking the right language and recognizing that, rightly or wrongly, in terms of promoting natural infrastructure solutions or partial solutions, we are the campaigners. We are the ones who are having to try and influence the build infrastructure community. They are not trying to influence or persuade us. So perhaps we should also start challenging them to persuade us that built infrastructure is the solution and explaining when it is. So we know you're not getting the question right. Communicating in the languages we happily talk, even things like ecosystem services language, and I bet you half the room will have a different definition of it. And we also picked up. We're still now using, as we get into natural infrastructure discussions, green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, and some other words out there. So we need to get our own act together all together. And I think we also need, it's already been said, be better at actually evaluating how successful some of these approaches have been. I don't know the science particularly well, for example, on payments for ecosystem services, but there's an awful lot happening out there in different places. How well has it worked? Can we compile? There's another bolus of Mark nicely to say, I think there's a key role for you. Look at whether or not payments for ecosystem services schemes do have good monitoring and evaluation mechanisms within them, and what do they tell us? Has it worked? Has it been a perverse incentive, as it can be sometimes? Looking at offset approaches, for example, mitigation banking in the US, seems to have a risk of it actually being too simple a solution of giving them a pocket paying away and not actually dealing with the opportunities of minimizing impact. I think we need to tell some of those stories more clearly when we're promoting some of these possible sort of natural infrastructure approaches a bit glibly. I mean, they need to actually have a clear understanding of do they work and if so, under what conditions do they work. So we're challenging ICN to take up cultures, I think, very nicely, to thank them for organising this session for us.
All right, thank you. I'm going to have the last word before Mark takes us out over to Jack Tordo, who's the grant director from the CEPF, just try and give us a summary of what he's heard. He's been sitting here diligently taking notes and gets the hard job of trying to synthesize over 2 hours of rich conversation into a few less bullet points. But Jack, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So I'll just take 5 minutes at the end to try and bring everything together. And obviously Andrew kicked us off with the first introduction, really taking us back to how quickly there's been evolution in bringing natural capital, natural infrastructure to the heart of the green economy concept. But he posed a question to the group about, do we actually know what natural infrastructure is? Do we have a common language and a common understanding of these terms? We then started to hear the 4 presentations from the panelists. Nick began by pointing to the problem of the lack of recognition that's out there of the huge values that we get from natural ecosystems, that we need to do more. We need to recognize we haven't been very successful to date in getting across the monetary and the non-monetary values of the systems that we all depend upon. He focused and he showed some very eye-opening graphs that I particularly liked about the particular values of coastal and inland wetlands, not just because we're getting economic values from them, but because these are amongst the most costly ecosystems to restore and repair should we damage or destroy them. Then we heard a series of examples from Nina, really focusing on creative and innovative solutions to some of these issues, highlighting the need for partnership, the role for civil society, but also the role for many sectors that work together, the private sector, government, with some maybe catalytic funding from the donor side, how solutions can emerge on the small scale, on the local scale. She gave various examples from India, South Africa and other places of how partnerships between different sectors can really demonstrate real solutions on the ground. But then that in itself poses the question, how can we take this to scale? And this was the challenge that Valerie took on in her presentation. She started to think about, from the World Bank's perspective, how natural infrastructure can contribute to being an engine for inclusive green growth,
Her conclusion was sometimes there are some conditions in which it can play a major role, particularly in increasing the resilience of communities at the agricultural frontier, particularly in the water sector. She gave an example of the catchment protection for hydropower operations, and also to help rural dispersed communities. And then she gave a path forwards of different steps of how we might get to a more scaled up and a more accepted use of natural infrastructure as a key component of green economies. And I think what was interesting that when we went through our discussions from the 4 groups, a lot of the points that she put out there were also echoed in those recommendations for the steps forward. But of course, she also made the point, we've got to get the policy frameworks right, and that led then on to Omar's presentation, where he's very encouragingly, I thought, pointed to the fact that a lot of the tools that we need are already out there. We've got public-private partnerships, we've got PES, there's a whole science around valuation of ecosystem services, we've got investment funds, and we've got these in place, but we've really got to do a little bit more. We have to look at the pilots, and he really pointed again to the value of partnerships. These emerging alliances between engineers, between civil society groups coming together to speak a common language and put forward green adaptation in water management and in other sectors. So really, I'll just move on just in a couple of lines, summarising the discussions from the groups. I think one thing I heard is that the evidence base that we're all saying we need is starting to emerge. It just hasn't coalesced yet. It's out there in different places, but it's often at a smaller scale. Perhaps more needs to be done to evaluate this more systematically. It's not just about success stories, it's also about more systematically understanding success rates, understanding failure rates, understanding the conditions and the applicability of these approaches. Clearly, there's always going to be a need for hard infrastructure. Natural infrastructure has niches, but where are those niches? And also we have to be communicating the results of these pilots and demonstration projects more in the economic terms that Ministry of Finance will understand: job creation, wealth creation. It isn't just about this dollar value on the ecosystem service. Then in terms of some of the barriers to taking that forward, we heard from everybody, I think, the policy makers often lack an understanding or an interest or support for these approaches. And we're sometimes constrained by terminology. We all use the same words, but we may give different meanings or have different understandings of what is meant by natural capital or natural infrastructure. There is a lot of funding out there in theory to invest in infrastructure, but to get to the point where natural infrastructure has been taking up, there might not be all the funding we need to catalyse that. Funding for pilots, funding for evidence collection, funding for communication. And perhaps sometimes we're not always speaking to the right audiences. Perhaps we're speaking to the right audience, but we're not using the right sets of information or the right arguments. And sometimes perhaps we're not the right people to make the arguments. Perhaps if you're a conservation group or you're a scientific researcher, maybe you're not as convincing as if you're an engineer. Maybe we have to work more with the engineers and let them put the arguments forward. And alliances and partnership, again, is going to be critical to that. So apart from that, the other steps forwards will be to codify the terminology, develop more proof of concepts, but not just a whole list of small success stories. Start to bring these together more systematically to really understand success rates, conditions, etc. And also, a very important point was made that the stocks of natural capital also should be considered. It isn't just about the flows that we're getting. We have to build alliances, and we have to provide guidance. I think that a lot of people pointed to the value of guidance on evidence collection. And finally, to build trust amongst the public. The public have got a lot of faith in cement, but let's make them be faithful in natural systems. So at the end of the day, we're the ones who are going to have to do this. There's a lot of steps to go forward. I think there's a broad common understanding of what those steps are from this session. So therefore, I can only thank you all for coming, to contributing your ideas, and I can just encourage you to go forwards in your own fields and try to take some of these steps and maybe, you know, we'll be getting a bit, I mean, as Andrew said to begin with, there's been a lot of progress in putting the concept into the heart of green economies, but now we've got to provide the evidence base. So thank you all. I think I'm going to be the person to close, so we're finished. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to all the panel members.